In a village where the sun seemed to cast longer shadows than light, there lived a girl whose days were swallowed by hardship. Her hands were small, delicate once, but now blistered and cracked from endless toil. While other children her age laughed in the fields, chased goats, and sang songs in the evenings, she was bent low in the dirt, breaking her back beneath the commands of a man who had taken the place of her father. This man was no guardian, no protector. He was her stepfather, cruel in word and deed, his heart heavy with bitterness. Where kindness should have lived, there was only scorn. He believed strength was measured in how much pain he could cause, and so he poured his spite into the life of the girl, making her into both servant and scapegoat. The villagers whispered when they saw her laboring. They knew her suffering, for her stepfather was unrelenting. Yet whispers remained whispers, for few dared to intervene. He carried himself with authority, and his words often dripped with threats. The girl learned early that tears brought no comfort. She swallowed them, letting them fall quietly into the soil as she worked, unseen by all but the earth itself. Her stepfather, however, seemed to grow taller with every moment he saw her weaken, convinced that grinding her spirit into the dirt was a victory. Her tasks were endless: hauling water, carrying wood, scrubbing floors, tending goats that were not hers to tend. Yet, when her stepfather's cruelty grew sharper, he devised a punishment unlike any other. With a twisted smile, he forced her into the graveyard, commanding her to dig. "If you are so weak," he would sneer, "then learn the weight of death." The graves she dug were not for anyone specific. They were empty holes, his cruel amusement. Each day she sank her shovel into the soil, carving open the earth as though she were feeding it. The graveyard became her prison, a place where the sun felt colder, where the air itself clung heavy with silence. Still she obeyed. She dug with trembling arms until her muscles burned, until her palms bled raw. To the villagers, it was a cruel spectacle, a child punished in the land of the dead. Yet they watched with uneasy silence, fearful that to question him would bring his wrath upon them too. The girl became known as the Child of Graves, though she had never asked for the title. In her silence, she endured, her eyes dimming but never losing their spark completely. For deep within her heart, even through exhaustion, she carried the memory of her late mother's gentle voice, the one thing her stepfather could never bury. But the graveyard was not a place of emptiness, though the man thought it so. As she labored, shoveling soil from dawn until the last red light of dusk, she did not know that the earth listened. She did not know that each tear she shed into the dirt was a seed of something greater, that the shadows stretching long between the headstones were watching her silently. The ancestors, buried beneath the soil, stirred at the sound of her pain, their rest uneasy beneath the cruelty inflicted upon one so innocent. The stepfather, proud in his wickedness, laughed at the sight of her worn figure and calloused hands. He saw only his dominance, never sensing that every grave dug was not just a hole but a promise. For the earth does not forget and the dead do not forgive. Soon, the very ground he mocked would turn against him, and the girl who had been forced to dig graves for others, would see those same graves whisper his name in the darkness of night. The punishment he had crafted for her was not hers to bear alone, it was waiting to return to him. The girl's spirit was a lantern in a world that tried every day to snuff it out. Though her stepfather forced her to dig with hands blistered and raw, she carried no hatred in her heart. Her days were filled with cruelty, yet she moved through them with a gentleness that seemed almost otherworldly. When she entered the graveyard with her shovel dragging behind her, she did not see only soil and stone. She saw resting places, sacred grounds where stories lay beneath the earth. While her stepfather mocked the graves and treated them as nothing but pits for his own cruel amusement, she whispered to them as if speaking to old friends. She would pause in her digging to brush dust from a weathered marker or pull weeds away from a forgotten headstone, her small acts of care giving the dead the dignity they had long been denied. Sometimes, when the moon rose and cast its silver glow over the rows of graves, she would sit on the edge of one, her arms wrapped around her knees. She spoke in hushed tones, telling the silent earth her secrets, her sorrows, and her hopes. "I wish you peace," she would say softly, "and if you can hear me, I hope you know I mean no harm." These moments were not only her comfort but also her rebellion. Though her stepfather sought to break her by tying her to death, she found in death a kind of companionship, a quiet place where her heart could breathe. The villagers, from a distance, sometimes glimpsed her speaking to the graves and shook their heads. Some said she was cursed. Others whispered that she was strange, too gentle for a world so harsh. Yet, in the hearts of a few there was admiration. They could see that she, though young and frail, carried a kind of dignity untouched by her suffering. While her stepfather walked tall with cruelty, She stood small yet unyielding, refusing to let his darkness define her. Her kindness was not only for the dead. Even in her exhaustion she found ways to help the living. When children wandered near the graveyard, frightened by the shadows, she would smile and reassure them. "Do not fear," she whispered, "the ones who rest here mean no harm." If a widow passed by with offerings for her husband's grave, the girl would help carry them, setting the basket carefully upon the earth as though placing it into the hands of the unseen. Her gentleness made others uneasy, for they could not understand how someone so wronged could still shine with such light. At home, the contrast between her and her stepfather was sharp, like fire against water. He stormed through life with fists and harsh words, filling every room with the weight of his anger. She moved quietly, her voice soft, her actions tender, never answering cruelty with cruelty. Where he cursed, she prayed. Where he mocked, she respected. Where he struck, she endured with silent tears. To some, this made her weak. To others, it revealed a strength deeper than muscle or authority. For every lash of his bitterness only made her resolve to remain kind grow stronger. There were nights when he made her dig even after dusk, when the shadows of the graveyard grew long and the air grew heavy. She would tremble at first, her shovel clinking against rocks in the cold soil, but soon she would steady herself by speaking aloud. "I am not alone," she whispered, her breath clouding in the night air. "You are here with me, all of you." And somehow, in the rustle of leaves or the soft sigh of the wind, it felt true. Her heart found comfort where none should have been, her innocence bridging the world of the living and the dead. This quiet purity only deepened the cruelty of her stepfather's shadow. His laughter at her toil echoed like a cruel drumbeat through her days. He spat at her reverence, mocking her for speaking to cold bones beneath the ground. But what he could not understand was that the very thing he forced upon her became her sanctuary. His darkness had tried to bury her spirit, but in the graveyard she found strength. He sought to make her a creature of despair, yet she became instead a vessel of light, her soul glowing softly against the endless night he pressed upon her. The contrast between them became a story the villagers themselves began to whisper. "She is pure," some said, "though the man who rules her life is made of nothing but cruelty." The girl never knew of these whispers, for she carried her burdens quietly, never boasting, never asking for pity. But it was true, her innocence stood in defiance of his evil, like a candle that continues to burn though the wind howls. Each grave she tended became a testament to her resilience. Each whispered prayer to the dead was a reminder that she would not let hatred grow in her heart. Even as her stepfather forced her to bend her back to the soil, she lifted her spirit higher with compassion. The world thought she was weak, but in truth, her gentle nature carried a power her stepfather would one day come to fear. For while he believed himself master over her life, he did not see that the very graves she respected were beginning to stir, listening closely to the voice that spoke to them with kindness. And in time it would be his own name they would whisper back. From the first light of dawn until the fading glow of sunset, the stepfather drove the girl into the cemetery grounds with a command that rang harsher than any whip. She was handed no rest, no reprieve, only the endless order, dig. With her bare hands blistering around the wooden handle of the shovel, she broke the earth again and again, the soil staining her skin, her sweat mixing with dust. Her body ached, her back bent, and yet still he pushed her harder. Where most would see a place of silence and respect for the dead, he saw only a field of labor meant to break her spirit. To him, the graves were not sacred but tools, the earth not holy but a pit to consume her youth and strength. His cruelty was not born of necessity but of delight, for each swing of her shovel was a reminder of his control, each grave dug a testament to his dominance. The villagers watched, day after day, their hearts tightening with pity as the girl labored in the relentless sun. Some whispered among themselves that no child should be treated so. Others murmured that the ancestors would not remain silent forever. But their voices never rose beyond whispers, for fear gripped them as firmly as his cruelty did her life. The stepfather was a man of temper, a man whose tongue could wound as deeply as his hand, and none dared confront him. Those who once tried to reason with him had been driven away with insults, mocked for their compassion, and reminded that his household was his own to command. And so, though they pitied the girl and shook their heads at her suffering, they turned their eyes away when he shouted and struck, leaving her to the merciless rhythm of his demands. His cruelty was not born only of hatred but of a greed that gnawed endlessly at him. He believed himself a man rising in power, a man destined to be remembered not for kindness or wisdom but for wealth and authority. The land on which the graves lay, he claimed as his own to exploit. "The living pay me to bury their dead," he would boast, spitting into the soil as though to mark it with his pride. He saw in the girl's labor a way to enrich himself without lifting a hand. To him, she was no child of the house, no orphan to protect, but a tool to feed his greed. He would stand by the edge of the graves, arms folded, smirking at her exhaustion, caring only that each pit was dug deeper, wider, ready to earn him more coin. But beneath the soil he desecrated with his arrogance lay a truth he could not see. The villagers sometimes noticed the wind shift strangely when he walked among the graves, a chill that raised the hair on their arms even in the heat of day. A diviner once warned him quietly, "Do not command the child to toil in the land of the ancestors, for the dead hear her cries." But he laughed, mocking the warning, calling it superstition of fools. "The dead are silent," he sneered, "and silence cannot harm me." His pride sealed his ears to wisdom, his greed blinded his eyes to omens. Still there were signs. The soil seemed heavier some days, resisting the girl's shovel as though the earth itself resented being torn open for his profit. At night, owls gathered on the crooked trees that lined the cemetery, their unblinking eyes fixed upon his home. Dreams came to him, shadows at the edge of sleep, whispers that pressed against his ears. But he dismissed them all, convincing himself that no spirit, no ancestor, no force of earth or sky could touch him. In his heart he believed himself untouchable. Yet the girl, though silent under his cruelty, carried within her a quiet endurance that the earth itself seemed to recognize. As she dug, her sweat falling into the graves, she whispered small words of respect to the resting souls, honoring those her stepfather mocked. The dead listened to her, not to him. Her voice, soft as it was, reached into the soil where his arrogance could not. And though she endured his cruelty day after day, her light did not wither. It shone brighter against his darkness, the stark contrast between the purity of her spirit and the corruption of his heart. What he could not know, what his pride kept him blind to, was that the ancestors were listening. Every strike of the shovel, every tear that fell into the earth, every insult hurled from his lips was being counted. The balance of justice was tilting, though he still strutted with pride. His cruelty seemed to stretch endlessly, but beneath the surface of the earth, something ancient stirred, waiting for the moment when his greed and cruelty would finally demand an answer. Day after day, the girl's world was reduced to the weight of the shovel and the unending stretch of soil before her. From the moment the sun rose, she dug, her blistered hands wrapped in rags that did little to protect her from the wood's bite. Each stroke of the shovel carved into her palms, reopening wounds that never healed. Blood mingled with sweat, falling into the earth as though the land itself was fed by her suffering. The graves stretched endlessly across the field, row upon row, their shadows seeming to lengthen as if mocking her exhaustion. To her stepfather they were proof of his control, evidence of his power. To her they were cages without walls, holes that swallowed her strength and left her body aching. Each grave felt heavier than the last, not just in the lifting of soil but in the burden it placed upon her heart. She could no longer count how many she had dug, for the days blurred together in a haze of labor and pain. Sometimes, as she leaned against the shovel for breath, she would imagine that the graves stretched forever, an unbroken chain that mirrored her suffering. She wondered if she too was being buried slowly, not beneath soil but beneath cruelty, inch by inch, day by day. The earth itself seemed to respond to her torment. As her shovel sank into the ground, there were moments when the soil sighed, shifting with a sound that was almost like breath. Sometimes, when she collapsed to her knees in exhaustion, she could feel a strange stillness beneath her palms, as if the earth listened to her heartbeat, storing her pain within its depths. She did not cry loudly, her tears were quiet, falling silently into the graves, but the earth seemed to drink them as though each one carried weight, each one becoming part of the soil's memory. The villagers noticed the change, though they dared not speak it aloud. Passing by, they would see the girl's bent figure against the horizon, digging as though the world itself had sentenced her to this labor. And though they pitied her, there was something unsettling about the graves now. They seemed too many, too wide, their presence heavy in the air. The cemetery no longer felt like a place of rest but a place holding its breath, as though waiting. At night, when the wind moved across the fields, some swore they heard a low murmur rising from the earth, a sound like voices beneath the soil. The girl, though broken in body, did not let her spirit collapse. She whispered to the graves as she worked, offering respect where her stepfather showed none. But deep within her she could feel it, the earth was not just sighing with her pain. It was learning it, holding it, echoing it back in a language she could almost understand. At first, the whispers had been soft, a gentle balm for her weary spirit. They had soothed her loneliness and reminded her that she was not abandoned. But as the nights passed, the voices did not fade. Instead, they grew bolder, clearer, as though the earth itself had found its tongue and would not be silenced. Each time she laid her aching body down, she braced herself for their return, and they came faithfully, like guardians who had risen from the grave to keep watch over her. The tone of their murmur shifted. Where once they spoke words of comfort, now they carried weight, like the toll of drums before a battle. Their whispers no longer stayed confined to her dreams or her ears. They filled the air around her so that even when she closed her eyes she could see them, feel them, moving through the night air like smoke curling between the trees. The earth trembled faintly beneath her mat, a heartbeat too vast to belong to anything mortal. And with this change came something more startling. They began to echo her suffering. She would hear them speak of her blisters, her wounds, her hunger, her tears, naming each cruelty she endured under her stepfather's hand. We saw when he made you dig under the merciless sun. We saw the blood that stained your palms. We heard when your stomach groaned from hunger, yet you were given nothing. We counted every insult he spat upon your head. Their voices, layered like hundreds of unseen throats, rose and fell with grief that was not only hers but theirs too, as though the ancestors themselves mourned her pain. The girl would lie awake, trembling not from fear but from awe. She had never imagined that the earth, silent beneath her suffering each day, was secretly listening. She never thought the dead could feel what she felt. And yet now she understood. The ancestors were not gone, they were here, resting in the earth that she broke open with her own blistered hands. She was closer to them than anyone else, closer than those who lived in comfort and ignored their whispers. In her silence, in her tears, she had become their companion, their chosen witness. Then one night the voices changed again. She felt it before she heard it, a heaviness in the air like a storm building over the horizon. The cemetery pulsed with energy, and then she heard them call a name. Not hers. Her stepfather's. The first time it was faint, almost uncertain. But then it came again, stronger, a dozen voices merging into one chilling chorus. His name. The girl froze, her heart pounding as the sound rolled across the graves, seeping through the walls of the hut. Night after night they repeated it. Sometimes a whisper that crept into her dreams, other times a chant that grew so loud she thought the whole village must hear it. Yet no one stirred but her. He cannot hide, the voices told her. The soil remembers the hands that command cruelty. The ground has marked him. She listened with wide eyes, her breath caught in her throat. Though she pitied herself, she had never pitied him. Now she began to feel the strange weight of justice forming, as though the earth had grown weary of his wickedness and would soon act. There were nights when she tried to cover her ears, but the sound seeped through her bones. Other nights she pressed her palms together and whispered, "Why do you call his name? What will you do to him?" The earth gave no answer, except to chant again and again, louder, stronger, vibrating through the walls until the hut seemed to shake. She was no longer just a listener. She was a witness to something vast and unexplainable, a stirring of power older than the village itself. In awe, she sat upright during those nights, staring toward the cemetery she could not see but could always hear. Her heart was torn between fear and hope. Fear because she sensed that the voices carried punishment with them, a punishment that would not be small. Hope because she knew that in their power her suffering was being acknowledged, and the scales of justice, long tilted against her, were finally shifting. The ancestors were awake now, and they were calling. That night, when the girl finally dragged herself to the corner of the hut she was allowed to sleep in, her body trembled with exhaustion. The ache in her shoulders burned, her hands raw and blistered from gripping the shovel. She lay on the mat of straw, staring at the ceiling through the darkness, listening to the silence of the night. But it was not silent for long. From the cemetery, from the rows of graves she had carved into the earth with her own blood and sweat, came a faint sound. At first she thought it was the wind curling through the grass or the branches creaking. But then it grew steadier, softer, yet undeniably present. Voices. They rose like murmurs from beneath the soil, too faint for ordinary ears, but to her, they rang clear as though meant only for her. She held her breath, her heart pounding with sudden fear. Yet as she listened closer, she realized the voices carried no malice. There was no threat in them, no anger, no hunger for revenge. Instead, they spoke with tones that felt warm, ancient, and familiar, like the comforting hum of elders telling stories by firelight. The whispers seemed to weave together, one voice flowing into another until they formed a chorus of comfort. "Child, you are not alone," they breathed. "Your suffering is seen. Your tears do not fall unseen. Your pain has been gathered by the earth, and the ancestors remember. The words were not in her ears alone but seemed to move through her body, settling deep into her chest, easing the sharp ache she had carried all day. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not born of sorrow. They were of relief, of recognition, of something greater than herself reaching down to touch her broken spirit. She pressed her palms together tightly as though in prayer and whispered back, her voice trembling, "You hear me? You truly hear me?" The graves seemed to sigh, their murmurs growing stronger, wrapping around her like invisible arms. They promised her that she was not forgotten, that the earth itself had held on to her cries and her pain, and in the silence of the night, the dead would keep her company. She had been made to feel worthless by her stepfather's cruelty, but in that moment, the whispers reminded her of her value, her sacredness, her dignity that no amount of labor or cruelty could erase. Though her body was battered, though her spirit had been pushed close to despair, the voices gave her strength. They spoke of justice that would come in its own time. They told her that the earth never slept, that every wound inflicted upon her was marked into the soil, and that no cruelty escaped the eyes of the ancestors. And as she drifted into sleep, the voices continued to hum like a lullaby, steady and eternal, carrying her into dreams where she was no longer digging endless holes but walking freely through fields of light. At first, the stepfather brushed it off as foolishness. A man of brute strength and iron pride, he did not believe in whispers from the dead or curses from the ancestors. Yet the nights began to grow heavier for him, filled with strange noises that clawed at the corners of his mind. At times, he thought he heard faint scratching beneath the earth, as though 100 unseen fingers were clawing up from below. Other nights, it was a low murmur drifting through the wind, so soft that it might have been dismissed as imagination, yet the sound always seemed to carry his name. He told himself it was nothing. The dead could not harm him. He was the living master of his house, and fear was not a thing he allowed himself. But the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. As he lay on his mat, sweat beading his forehead, he tossed and turned in restless sleep. Dreams rose up to strangle him, unrelenting, dragging him into the very graves he had forced the girl to dig. In one dream, he stood at the edge of the cemetery, the ground freshly tilled, dozens of graves yawning like hungry mouths. The soil trembled, then burst open, skeletal hands reaching out, not for the girl but for him. They gripped his ankles, pulled at his arms, and dragged him screaming into the pit. He would wake gasping for breath, his chest pounding, dirt still clinging to his skin as though he had truly been buried. Night after night, the dreams pursued him. Sometimes he saw his own name carved crudely into headstones, sometimes he heard his own voice screaming from beneath the earth while the girl stood above, silent, watching with tear-stained eyes. Other times, the earth itself split open beneath him, the graves he had commanded her to dig collapsing into a pit that swallowed him whole. Each dream left him weaker, and though the mornings came with sunlight, the shadows of the cemetery clung to his eyes. Yet instead of softening his heart, the dreams twisted it further. Fear made him crueler. When he woke trembling, instead of seeking forgiveness, he unleashed his terror upon the girl. He shouted louder, struck harder, and forced her to dig with even less rest. "You think the earth speaks to you?" he spat at her once, his eyes wide and bloodshot from sleepless nights. "You think you are favored? No, you are nothing. You are dirt, and dirt you will remain." His voice cracked, betraying the tremor in his soul, but his fists came down heavier, as though punishing her might silence the echoes tormenting him. But the whispers did not fade. They seemed to grow bolder each time he raised his hand against her. At first he only heard them when he closed his eyes at night, but soon they crept into his waking hours. While walking through the marketplace, he would suddenly hear a low chorus weaving through the crowd. His name. When drinking from his gourd of water, he swore he could hear voices gurgling up from the bottom. His name. When he passed by the graves during the day, the wind itself seemed to sigh and chant. His name. He snarled at shadows, hurled stones at empty holes, even cursed the sky, but nothing silenced the voices. The villagers began to notice the change. His once proud posture grew hunched, his eyes darting like a hunted animal's. Where he once strode through the village with arrogance, now he snapped at every sound, every whisper of children's laughter. He accused neighbors of plotting against him, of sending spirits to curse his sleep. Some shook their heads and muttered that the ancestors had turned their gaze upon him at last. Others pitied him but dared not say so aloud. Still he clung to his cruelty as a shield. Each day, he forced the girl to dig deeper, longer, as though burying her in work might bury the voices that haunted him. He denied her food, ignored her wounds, and mocked her tears. Yet even in his rage, he could not deny the truth that gnawed at him. the graves did not call her name. They only called his. By the time the moon had cycled its course, the man was a shell of himself. His nights were filled with shrieking visions, his days haunted by whispers on the wind. He had hoped to break the girl with labor and humiliation, but instead, it was he who bent under the weight of something unseen. Though he refused to admit it aloud, deep in the hollows of his heart he knew the truth. The graves were waiting for him, and each spade of dirt the girl struck into the earth was preparing the bed where his body would one day lie. That night, the air itself felt heavier, as though the village had been swallowed by a silence that pressed against every ear. Even the crickets seemed unwilling to sing, and the wind refused to stir the trees. The girl, weary from another long day of digging, sat quietly near the graves, her blistered hands resting in her lap. She had learned to endure the voices at night, the whispers that wrapped around her like comfort. But on this night they did not murmur softly. They rose in unison, louder than she had ever heard, like 1,000 voices spilling out of the earth at once. The graveyard trembled with sound. Some voices moaned low, like drums echoing in the belly of the earth, while others rose sharp and shrill, slicing through the air like horns. Together they formed a chorus that shook the night, the kind of sound that made even the stars above seem to flicker. The girl lifted her head, her wide eyes reflecting both fear and awe, for the voices did not speak to her this time. They called only one name, her stepfather's. From across the village, the stepfather tossed and turned in his mat, sweat slicking his face. He had hoped for a night of peace, but instead the sound began to crawl through his walls, rattling in his bones. At first, he tried to bury his ears beneath his blanket, but the sound grew louder, as though the graveyard itself was pressing against his door. He could not endure it. Grabbing a lantern with shaking hands, he stormed out into the night, muttering curses to hide the tremor in his throat. The closer he came to the graveyard, the stronger the voices grew. The ground seemed to throb beneath his feet, each step echoing with an unnatural beat, like the pulse of a great heart buried under the soil. The lantern light quivered in his hands as shadows danced along the gravestones. When he stepped through the gates, the sound engulfed him. The graves moaned his name. Over and over they chanted it, stretching it long, dragging it through the dirt, until the syllables no longer sounded human but monstrous, carried by the mouths of the dead. The man stumbled forward, his bravado slipping like sand through his fingers. He shouted at the graves, demanding silence, demanding respect, but his voice was a thin reed swallowed by the roar of the earth. The lantern shook so violently that its light broke into fragments across the stones. His knees grew weak, and for a moment he thought the ground would split beneath him and drag him down to join the chorus. From her place in the shadows, the girl watched silently. Her eyes were wide, her body trembling, but she did not move. She saw him lurch from one grave to another, his lips twisted in fear, his proud chest caved inward as though the weight of the ancestors pressed down on him. The voices grew deafening, echoing through the night like a storm of the dead, each one clawing at his soul. He tried to back away but his feet tangled and he fell hard onto the dirt, his lantern clattering away and sputtering out. Now he was in darkness, surrounded by graves that would not stop calling. His name rose like thunder, like the final judgment of the ancestors, each voice hammering into him until his breath came in ragged gasps. He crawled backward on shaking hands, eyes darting wildly, searching for escape that did not exist. For the first time in his life, he looked small, broken, stripped of his cruelty, reduced to nothing but a frightened man before the power of the unseen. The girl did not smile, did not gloat. She simply watched, her own heart heavy with the knowledge that justice was unfolding. For the voices that shook the graveyard did not call her name. They never had. They belonged only to him. That night, the stillness of the village was broken by something none had ever heard before. The whispers that had long curled around the girl's ears alone now rose into the air, weaving through the branches of the trees, slipping beneath doors and echoing in every hut. It began faint, a ripple like the wind stirring dry leaves, but soon it grew louder, a chorus rising from the graveyard that carried on the night wind. The villagers stirred from their sleep, frightened, pressing hands against their hearts as the sounds grew clearer. The voices were not random murmurs. They carried weight, authority, and the unshakable tone of ancestors long gone. They called out names, they cried warnings, and their grief rolled like thunder across the thatched roofs. Men rushed out of their huts, clutching spears they did not know how to use against such unseen forces. Women gathered their children, whispering prayers, while elders hobbled forward, their eyes wide with dread. All of them turned toward the graveyard, where a glow seemed to shimmer faintly in the distance. From that direction came the chanting, now unmistakable, voices of the dead speaking with power. The villagers exchanged fearful glances, muttering that the stepfather's cruelty had poisoned the soil, that the earth itself had grown weary of his wickedness. Some recalled old proverbs about the danger of tormenting the innocent, about how the ancestors always watched. Others whispered that the girl, who had long been pitted in silence, must have been chosen, for how else could she survive digging graves under the pitiless sun and still shine with gentleness? Children clung to their mothers, asking if ghosts had come to take them away. The elders hushed them, but even they could not hide their trembling. They remembered tales from their own youth, when spirits had once risen to punish a greedy chief, and how his name was never spoken again. Those same elders now lowered their eyes toward the girl, who stood by the graves unharmed, her face calm despite the chaos. To the villagers she no longer looked like a helpless orphan. There was something in the way she held herself, something in the way the night air bent around her, that made them murmur she was under protection. Some said the spirits had wrapped her in their cloak. Others whispered she was the vessel through which the ancestors spoke. The fear shifted from her to the stepfather, whose name the voices had begun to chant with terrifying clarity. Men who once bowed their heads to him now muttered that he had brought this upon them all. Women who once pitied the girl now crossed their arms and nodded, saying that the ancestors had grown tired of watching her suffer. The air in the village was thick with unease, as if the shadows themselves leaned in to listen. None dared to go near the graveyard, yet none could stay away. They lingered at the edges, hearts pounding, eyes fixed on the glowing horizon, whispering prayers and old chants of protection. By dawn, the truth had spread through every hut and every alleyway. The girl was no longer just the stepfather's victim. She was seen as the one shielded by powers far greater than any mortal cruelty. The villagers, who once turned away from her suffering in fear of her stepfather's wrath, now looked at her with awe. Some bowed their heads as she walked past. Others whispered blessings in her name. Though fear of the ancestors kept their voices low, everyone understood one thing clearly: the girl was no longer alone. The spirits had risen, and their anger was not hers to bear, it was his. And from that moment, the village waited with bated breath for the ancestors' judgment to fall. At sunrise, when the chants of the dead still lingered faintly in the air, the elders gathered at the council hut, their faces grave. None of them could deny what they had heard in the night. Their bones ached with the weight of fear, and they knew the matter could no longer be ignored. They summoned the diviners, the keepers of hidden knowledge, those who could speak with the spirits beyond the veil. The diviners arrived quietly, their bodies draped in skins and beads that rattled like distant rain. They spread out cowrie shells and bones on mats, their hands trembling as they cast them again and again. Each time, the signs revealed the same message. The ancestors were restless, their anger stirred by human wickedness. The elders leaned in close, hearts heavy, as the diviners spoke. The girl's suffering had been seen by the dead, they explained, and her stepfather's cruelty had torn open the boundary between the living and the buried. Every grave she dug had been a wound in the earth, every tear she shed a cry that reached the unseen world. The diviners warned that the stepfather's sins were too heavy to go unpunished. The voices would not rest until balance was restored. The ancestors had risen not to torment the girl but to defend her, to make plain to the whole village the depth of her innocence and the weight of his guilt. The council chamber grew silent. The elders, who had long looked away from the girl's pain, bowed their heads in shame. They had feared the stepfather's temper, his greed, his grasp over their village, but now they feared something greater, the wrath of their own ancestors. One of the oldest among them, his voice cracked with age, spoke words that none dared to deny. When the dead rise, they do not speak in vain. To dishonor the innocent is to dishonor the blood from which we all come. The diviners nodded, their eyes distant as if still listening to whispers carried on the wind. They urged the village to act with caution, to honor the girl openly, to shield her from further harm. They warned that if the villagers stood idle, the punishment would not only fall on the stepfather but could spread like fire through every hut and every household. Innocence, they said, must be protected, for it is the breath that keeps the ancestors at peace. The elders left the gathering with heavy hearts. They knew they could no longer remain silent. They sent word through the village, instructing families to leave offerings at their thresholds, to whisper blessings in the girl's name, and to remember that the ancestors were watching every choice they made. And though fear still gripped the people, it was now mingled with reverence. The girl who had once seemed powerless now carried the weight of the ancestors' favor, and the warning was clear: harm her, and the dead themselves would rise again. The stepfather's fall began quietly, like rot spreading unseen beneath the bark of a tree. At first, his wealth, which he guarded so fiercely, started to vanish. Crops on his land withered before harvest, his animals grew sickly and died, and the gold he hoarded seemed to lose its shine. Merchants who once traded with him now turned their backs, whispering that a curse clung to his name. His house, once filled with food and laughter meant only for himself, grew silent and empty. The villagers who had once feared him no longer greeted him in the square. Their eyes followed him with disgust, and their hands made protective signs when he passed. But it was not only his wealth that crumbled. His body, once strong from years of labor and pride, began to betray him. His back bent as though the graves he had forced his stepdaughter to dig were now pressing down upon his shoulders. His hands, once quick to strike, trembled uncontrollably. Nights gave him no rest. He tossed and turned, drenched in sweat, haunted by dreams of open graves and shadowed figures chanting his name. Each morning, he awoke weaker than the last, his face pale, his eyes hollowed like the pits he had once ordered dug. Madness soon crept in, a cruel companion that whispered when all else was quiet. He could no longer bear to pass the graveyard, for the voices there grew louder each day, calling him with a certainty that shattered his courage. But fleeing did not save him. The whispers followed him into the fields, into the market, even into his own house. At night, they grew so loud that he stuffed his ears with cloth, but still the voices found their way inside his skull. They chanted his name with relentless rhythm, promising that his time was near. The villagers began to avoid him completely. Mothers pulled their children close when he stumbled down the paths, wild-eyed and muttering to himself. Elders spoke of him as already gone, a man living only in the shadow of the ancestors' wrath. His stepdaughter, though, walked with quiet dignity, her hands gentle as ever, her presence calm. Where she went, people bowed their heads in respect, whispering blessings to her. Where he went, silence and scorn followed. Desperate, the stepfather tried to leave the village, but even the forest refused him. The wind howled through the trees like the voices of the dead, and the shadows stretched long as if to bar his escape. Every path seemed to lead him back to the graves he had once ordered dug, each corner of the land reminding him of the sin that had chained him to his doom. By the end he was a shell of the man he once was. His clothes hung loose on his frame, his hair unkempt, his voice cracked with fear. No one pitied him, for his cruelty had brought this fate upon himself. He was left broken, haunted, despised, living only as a lesson to all who dared mock the innocent or abuse the powerless. The voices never ceased, and each night, the graves called his name until the sound hollowed him from the inside out, leaving nothing but a man consumed by the weight of his own wickedness.